Thank you and good morning. Thank you all for joining us. Our panel today is Connecting You with Texas, the Federal Perspective, and we're going to talk about a variety of issues impacting all of us who work in infrastructure and deal with the federal government in that capacity. We have a great panel today, and I'm going to introduce each of them, give you some of the ground rules for how our panel is going to go, and including the Facebook Live option. And we'll start with Mr. Davis. Jeff Davis joins us here today from Eno Foundation, where he's a senior fellow. He's also the editor of Eno Transportation Weekly. And for many of us, our world stops each week when Transportation Weekly comes out, so we're very honored to have him here. We also have our Deputy Executive Director of Txdot, who you all know, Marc Williams. Marc works very closely with the Executive Director of Txdot and oversees the modal programs, including ports, maritime, airports. He also oversees occupational safety and Txdot's programs related to small and historically underutilized businesses. And finally, we have Murphie Barrett, who many of you know Murphie from her years on Capitol Hill with the House Transportation Committee. She worked on the FAST Act, and many of Txdot's leadership, I know, has spent a lot of time with Murphie talking about any variety of issues. So we're very honored to have her. She is now with AGC of America, based in Washington, D.C. I wanted to mention the Facebook option that we have. Anyone online is welcome to participate, and you can post questions for our panel throughout the course of our panel. So with that, I'm going to allow each of our panelists to offer some opening comments. Jeff, would you like to go first?
Thank you very much. I believe I was sent here to set the stage for the discussion of the donor-donee debate that everyone keeps talking about, how it developed. I'm a senior fellow with the Eno Center for Transportation, now in its 99th year, founded by traffic safety pioneer William Eno in 1921, that now studies all modes of transportation across up and down the federal, state, and local government chain. In the beginning, dun, 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 a little over 100 years ago, you had the first Federal Aid Road Act in 1916. 50-50 matching shares, equal federal-state partnership. And the money was apportioned via the first formula, which was 1/3 the land area of the state for the western states, 1/3 state population for the eastern states, and then 1/3 of each state's share of the U.S. Postal Service road miles as the federal share. Because this was actually as much of a postal clause in the Constitution thing as a interstate commerce clause thing back in the day. Each state picked the roads that it wanted to improve within that state, and the federal government was going to pick up half of it. And it was paid for out of general revenues. This predates the first gasoline taxes by several years. And then, as Senator Nicholas alluded to earlier, eventually came the interstate highway system. It was separate from the regular federal aid program. It's almost better to view it as its own big project. 1944, during World War II, Congress was looking ahead to after the war, and they commissioned a 40,000-mile system authorized by Congress. It took the 48 states and the Bureau of Public Roads till 1947 to agree on a map of 37,700 miles of where this would go, and they eventually added some urban extensions later to fill it out. They couldn't figure out how to fund it at all. They didn't start even de minimis funding until 1954, I'm sorry, with just little bits, but it was going to cost a lot of money. So they had to figure out, how are we going to pay to build this big system of interstate highways? And this is the map that they came up with in 1947. It says, the little fine print at the bottom is 1947. And this is the most important thing that's ever happened in the highway program, because any voter anywhere can look at that map and know there's no way North Dakota can pay for that east-west interstate going across the road. But some states would have to subsidize others in the name of national connectivity. So this was the issue. It was a vision of shared national sacrifice, and some states subsidizing others was always baked into the cake here for building the roads on this map. So in 1956, they kind of came up with a way to pay for this. They increased the existing federal taxes on motorists and truckers. They put all those tax receipts in a new dedicated highway trust fund. It was going to fund both the new interstate program and the existing federal aid program, because the gas tax wasn't related to the highway program before 1956. But they gave the existing smaller federal aid program first dibs on the revenues. They were going to pay for the interstate. There was no formula for the interstate, no formula, ever. They looked at that map and they said, how much is it going to cost to build the roads on this map? That system of 40,000 miles of divided 4 lanes, we will build the roads on that map. We will pay whatever it takes as long as it takes. So every 3 years, they added up, each state added up how much it was going to cost to build their yet unbuilt miles of that system on that map. And that's how they divided up the available money every 3 years. Totally separate, never was a formula. The original plan was, once the interstate got completely built, which they thought would be about 1973, the taxes would revert back to their pre-1956 levels and the trust fund would be abolished. Well, obviously that didn't happen. And the things took a lot longer to develop than they thought. So this is total FHWA apportionments to states, 1953 to 1996. And the line is just, what percentage of the total FHWA apportionments were just interstate construction? And you can see that after they figured out how to put the trust fund together, that line leaps up there. So starting from the late 50s through about 1972, the interstate, building those roads on that map, was about 70 to 80% of total FHWA funding. And then, starting in the 70s, most of the roads, like Senator Nichols said, in Texas, most of the roads got complete. Much of what was left was expensive urban extensions that were held up by lawsuits. So the interstate gradually faded out as a percentage of what the FHWA was doing until about 1996, where it hit zero. But, as you may know, they never abolished the Highway Trust Fund. They never let the taxes go back down. They had started in the 70s, they had problems. They had too much money at the federal level. They had to find new ways to spend it. This shows what percentage of, what took the place of interstate construction. This was 1983 on the left through 2009 on the right. The green there at the bottom, that's actually building interstate construction. You see that ended up. And they started an interstate maintenance program, the blue tranche above that, and that filled up some of it. And then the yellow tranche stack on top of that, that's the various donor-donee equity adjustments they started coming up with in 1982. Because the big square states, once their interstates were done, they thought, well, we should still get a percentage of the total program based on what we were getting when we were building the interstates in the first place. And then at the same time, other states started going, well, now that the interstate's done, we don't have to do this shared sacrifice and cross subsidies with other states anymore. We should concentrate more on getting a greater return on our motor fuels taxes. So the combination of keeping the low-density states whole for what they were getting at peak interstate and giving better rates of return for donor states, that's that yellow tranche. And the final thing that they replaced the interstate construction with were earmarks, that red tranche on top. So you can see that donor-donee adjustments, interstate maintenance, and earmarks together, kept picking up greater and greater shares of the program until 2009, at which point the whole system became locked into place. Every state is still getting the exact same share of formula and earmarks it got in 2009, except Texas, because Texas's gas tax adjustment is the only change we've had since fiscal year 2009. Without that map, that beautiful interstate map to hold the project together as a means of national sacrifice, it became every state for itself. Earmarks and the whole donor-donee fight are symptoms of the same problem, which is that enough states and voters don't really understand what the federal highway program means for them in terms of national goals and national shared sacrifice anymore. So what now? What do we do now? Interstate funding was never meant to be part of the whole formula system and donor-donee equity concerns. I'm personally convinced that we should take all interstate spending out of the donor-donee calculation now. That's like 31% of the total federal spending. It was 40% in Texas last year. And we ought to figure out how we're going to account for that $140 billion of general fund money we've plugged into the trust fund since 2008. And we finally got to ask ourselves, even if you could, put Humpty Dumpty back together and put the highway trust fund back on a sound user pay, user benefit relationship, should we? Is that even the goal we should pursue? And I believe that is the end of my opening little overview, and I pass the clicker over to Marc.
Well, thank you for that. And I know Mr. Williams also has some strong opinions about federal highway funding. And Marc, I'll turn it over to you for some opening comments.
Thank you, Andrea. And yes, it's been an important topic, our federal rate of return for the state of Texas. It's important because we do worse than anybody relative to the 49 other states. We're consistently at the bottom in terms of the proportion of federal revenue that we get back relative to what we contribute. And typically, quite often, we're the only donor state out of all 50 states. From time to time, there's one or two that kind of pop into that donor realm where they might not get their full portion of motor fuels tax revenue back from the federal government, but consistently you can always count on Texas being at the bottom and being a donor state. And so we talked a little bit about that at the forum last year, and I really appreciate this panel being here today with both Jeff and Murphie to really provide some perspective to you all in the audience about, one, why we're at the point where we're at in terms of the evolution of the Highway Trust Fund over the past decade. And then from Murphy's perspective, being involved in drafting reauthorization language as it comes through Congress. What are the issues that are at play? What makes it so difficult for us to move the needle relative to the rate of return issue from the state of Texas's perspective? And it's an important conversation, especially now. It's a very timely conversation because we now have we have on the Senate side a draft reauthorization that's been passed by the Environmental Public Works Committee, and then the House began to release their points and principles last week, and expect to hear more details on that coming up, and we expect potentially to hear something on the president's side as well. And so it's a very timely topic. It's a topic that it's important for us in Texas collectively, all of the stakeholders, to be aware of, to be educated on, and to be able to weigh in effectively with your elected officials in Washington.
Thank you, Marc. Murphie, you have a different perspective on things, having written the last bill and now working with AGC as we're moving into the next authorization process, and we'd love to hear your comments.
Well, sure. Thank you all for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm going to, at least for these initial remarks, take off my AGC of America hat and put on my old House and Senate Congressional staffer hat. I had the privilege of working both on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee for Ranking Member Inhofe of Oklahoma and the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee working for Chairman Schuster of Pennsylvania. And both of the bills that we did during my time, we had a wonderful team of people that really worked together in a bipartisan, bicameral fashion to get those bills across the finish line. But both MAP 21 and the FAST Act had, from my perspective, three issues that are completely intertwined when it comes to dealing with the formula and how federal funding is distributed for the Federal Aid Highway Program. The first big issue is funding. The second issue is the policy, and the third is the good old-fashioned politics of Washington, D.C. So from a funding perspective, what I'm referring to is, as Jeff kind of laid out, we have a highway trust fund that is running a shortfall in terms of the revenue that comes into the trust fund. We've had to do $140 billion of transfers from the general fund of the U.S. Treasury just to shore up that trust fund. And when we're doing that game, well, it is a bit of a game, it's a numbers game, we're looking at how much money can the trust fund support, both for an annual program spending level and also the number of years for the bill itself. Is it 2 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 3 or 4? What does that sort of look like? Then from a policy perspective, the members of Congress are dealing with, well, the very issue that Jeff raised. What is the vision from the federal perspective? What is the federal role in surface transportation investment? What are our goals? What are we trying to achieve? And I think you're starting to see, at least right now up in Congress, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later, some different visions for what is the federal role in surface transportation. You're seeing the Senate put forward one proposal, and you're seeing the House Democrats put forward a proposal. You're seeing my old committee with Ranking Member Sam Graves put forward another proposal, and then we're hopefully anticipating a proposal coming out from the White House later today or in the coming weeks. And then sort of layered with all of that vision question, you start to get into, well, who is spending the money? Is it state DOTs who should continue to spend a lot of that money? Is it different local transportation authorities or local agencies that should spend that money? Is it public transit agencies should spend that money? And all of that can kind of get pushed and pulled, and you start almost kind of playing one of those whack-a-mole, like arcade games, one goes down, the next one pops up, which sort of bleeds into the larger political question. I will tell you all that one of the most popular tables or popular questions that my bosses would get on the floor from their colleagues is, so how much money is my state getting? How much money did I get last year, and how much more money is my state getting now? If I vote for this bill, how much money do I get over the life of the bill, over the next 2 years, 3, 4, 5 years? That's what they want to see, and that really starts to impact votes. So the question comes for the committees, how do you, kind of rise all of the boats together? So just to touch on MAP 21 a little bit, which was the previous surface transportation law prior to the FAST Act, our current surface transportation law, that bill really did sort of propose more of a fundamental shift for federal surface transportation policy and programs. We went through a lot of consolidation and elimination of certain programs within the larger federal aid highway program. We instituted a performance management process, which some state DOTs were already doing at the time, but not all state DOTs were doing. We wanted states to set certain targets, reducing the number of fatalities and serious injuries on all public roads, looking at air quality issues, the condition and performance of the national highway system, those types of things. We wanted sort of an outcome-driven approach, and folks to really kind of look at the assets within their purview and kind of take care of those from a federal perspective. The problem was that bill only had 2 years worth of funding with very small increases in funding from the previous year. So you have basically 5 or 6 years worth of a fundamental policy change and 2 years in which to do it, and really not significantly more money. So it was sort of a rock and a hard place, I guess, to kind of be in from a congressional perspective. And then for all of our non-federal partners, that was a bit of a climb, I think, too. And we didn't change the formula. We thought about changing the formula. I won't tell you how late and how many sleepless nights we had staring at spreadsheets trying to figure out how to change the formula, since it hadn't been changed since the prior law went into place. And at the end of the day, we couldn't change it. We didn't have the money to sort of smooth out any bumps that were occurring to states that might lose money if we changed sort of the inputs into the formula. We didn't have the years to kind of make that possible. So we largely just said, okay, well, states are going to get guaranteed 95% of the money back for the money they contribute in the Highway Trust Fund from fuel tax revenue. FAST Act came along, the next bill. Good news is we had more years. We had a longer bill. The House proposal was 6 years. The Senate proposal was 5 years. We ended up as a public law with 5 years. But again, we didn't have significant increases in funding. We were still going through a lot of the implementation efforts for that fundamental shift in federal surface transportation policy and programs that MAP 21 required. And again, we could not change the formulas either. So we are still largely at where we were before under the bill prior to MAP 21, which was safety lieu, and we continue to allow states to receive 95% of those rate of return back. And I think it's an open question to see whether or not Congress will try to take on that issue again. But I think it's going to have to be all three of those issues. The funding, the policy, and the politics are going to have to kind of come together on that larger chessboard to create an opportunity for Congress to possibly change the formula funding distributions.
So Murphie, my question for you is, nothing has changed, right? So is it entirely possible that with the passage of the next surface transportation authorization bill, we will again not have formulas? We may again just move that same ratio of funding forward for all the states?
I think it's an open question. I think the Senate has largely not taken up the formula fight again in terms of actually kind of changing the inputs into the formula itself. If you could kind of read between the tea leaves in terms of what the House Democrats put out in their framework from last week, I think it was now just last week, sorry, it's all blurring together. Some of the documents that they've put out have hinted at a formula change, have hinted at different policy priorities becoming more of a priority than where they are currently sitting. They've also are going to look at who is spending the money. Is it the state DOTs who should spend the money? Is it the local entities, the local public transportation authorities that should spend that money? So I think it's possible that Chairman DeFazio and his colleagues will go after a formula change. At the end of the day, though, they're proposing a $760 billion proposal for infrastructure, well beyond surface transportation. And that is a huge amount of money. And the increases for surface transportation, both highways and transit, are also significant. So that may help smooth out some of those bumps with a proposed formula change. But if that money doesn't materialize in terms of actually being paid for or more general fund transfers occurring, it will make the formula changes difficult, and some of the things that they would like to see emphasized, climate change, reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, making more of the decision making at the local level, those are bigger policy changes that can impact people's willingness to have a formula conversation. So it's going to be interesting to see how the pieces move around on this chessboard.
Marc, we watch every year, and you alluded to this, if Texas is going to be the only donor state according to the Federal Highway Administration data. And according to the fiscal year 2020 data, we're not alone this year. Colorado and South Carolina have also fallen below that $1 100% rate of return. But it's a very obscure issue, and it's a very complex issue. And I'm curious what Txdot is doing to increase awareness of the issue and to work with other states to address the formula issue.
Well, we're taking several different approaches. I mentioned earlier in my earlier remarks that education is important, and so having these conversations is part of that. In addition, working to educate members of Congress has also been very important, and what we've been doing through a number of different steps. It started back with Governor Abbott sending a letter to our entire congressional delegation. Our commission has taken measures to communicate our issues there. Chairman Bugg sent a letter about this time last year to our entire congressional delegation, informing them and educating them on the importance and significance of this for Texas. And recently, back in the fall, we received a letter that was signed by the entire congressional delegation, all 38 members of the Texas congressional delegation, House and Senate, calling on House and Senate leadership, both with the head of the House and Senate in Congress and the chairs of the transportation committees, to help address this issue. Now, clearly, it's going to be a challenge because reopening the formulas is very difficult. It's going to be a marathon, not a sprint, and I think we're going to have to continue to work through making incremental changes to improve our rate of return federally.
Thank you. Jeff recently developed a catalog of formula changes for the Federal Highway Program, for federal transportation programs, and I wonder if you could take a moment and talk about some of those.
Yeah, this started a couple of years ago. A couple of different state people called me to ask if there was going to be some kind of systemic census undercount, how would it affect their potential highway funding? And I said, not a bit, because the incredibly stupid current system is that it doesn't matter if everyone moved out of your state. It doesn't matter if you built a lot of roads or you let your roads go back to gravel. It doesn't matter if you blew up your bridges or improved your bridges. Nothing matters. All that matters is how many earmarks your politicians got in 2005 and whatever the facts were on the ground as far as VMT, road miles, bridge condition in calendar year 2007, which was used for the fiscal year 2009 formulas, which are still frozen in place, with the single exception that Texas has triggered the 95% rate of return a couple of times, and every other state has had to give up a little smidgen to get to Texas. I put together a 4-page handout that details this, every dollar in 2009 and how it's changed since then. And you can, on that stand-up insert on your tables, you put your phone on the bottom right little QR code. You can download it if you are so inclined. But the current situation of just extending whatever the facts on the ground were in 2007 and the political pork barrel of 2005 was so dumb that we put together a series of options of how we could redesign these programs and move forward to a variety of scenarios and which states would be winners and losers at a constant dollar amount. Texas lost out on most of those just because your highway trust fund tax situation percentages to all your other situations are so out of whack. I mean, Texas has about 7% of interstate lane miles, 9% of total NHS, 8% of total NHS miles, 9.3% of federal aid miles, things like that. But, let's see, about 8.8% of the population, they're all in the 8-9% range. But you paid last year 10.1% of the gasoline taxes. But also, I would say, everyone in this room, never use the phrase gas tax again when you're talking about the Texas rate of return. Banish it. Say highway user tax, because you guys only paid 10.1% of the gasoline taxes into the highway trust fund. You paid almost 13% of the diesel taxes because of all the truck traffic in the area, border stuff, et cetera. And because the Federal Highway Administration has no idea how to allocate the excise tax on truck sales or the tires or the heavy truck use tax, their dirty little secret is they just take whatever your state percentage of diesel tax was and put those percentage in for the other taxes. So you're getting 13% of the diesel and trucking taxes, but only 10% of the paying of the gasoline taxes. So you should really start focusing on all of that. There's been a significant movement by the American Trucking Associations in the past saying maybe we shouldn't, maybe we should spend the diesel and trucking taxes on more core national highway system program things, and the truckers would be more willing to support fuel tax increases on diesel if that happened, and then take the gasoline taxes for some of the other stuff that's not on the national highway system, not the core federal interest, some of the stuff that's diverted down to the MPO level, et cetera. But basically any kind of rational formula you would go back to, none of the factors that Texas has now come close to approaching their percentage of highway trust fund tax payments. So that's basically the problem. And if you can't walk away from that argument now without losing a lot of money on a rational formula.
I would add to that, we also don't know how to capture the amount of general fund revenue that the state of Texas is contributing into the Highway Trust Fund, and we know it's significant. We know we're a state with a healthy economy. We know we're a massive state that's contributing far more.
Every time the federal government deposits general fund money into the trust fund, it's fungible with all the gas tax dollars. No way to track it. There's a Texan congressman named Randy Neugebauer who single-handedly saved the last bill. It was going to be a 2-year bill, and Neugebauer had the bright idea to steal $60 billion from the Federal Reserve, transfer money from the Fed to the general fund, to the highway trust fund, and let them have a 5-year bill instead of a 2-year bill. And show of hands, anyone in the room can figure out how to allocate money we stole from the Federal Reserve on a state-by-state basis. Can't be done. So, as long as we keep doing things like that to support the trust fund, these arguments about getting a larger percentage of total trust fund spending are a bit specious.
I think the bankers in the audience may feel like they contributed more than others. Murphie, let's go back to revenue options. As we're looking at the next Surface Transportation Authorization Bill, what do you think are some of the revenue options that are going to be on the table, and which ones are more politically viable than others?
Well, so, I think there are a growing number of members on both sides of the aisle that would like to return to a user pay, user benefit system. They would like to find a solution to the Highway Trust Fund. We're seeing more and more members talk publicly in that fashion, but then when you sort of drill down, whether you're congressional staff or you're a sort of a transportation advocate in my current capacity, and try to pull that a little bit further down and say, okay, well, so would you be supportive of a fuel tax increase? Well, okay, well, what about indexing those current fuel taxes to inflation? We've lost an enormous amount of purchasing power since the last time those fuel taxes were raised in 1993. Well, and this is both sides. This is Republicans and Democrats. This is House and Senate. This is a very purple issue. Okay, well, what about the vehicle miles traveled? Well, yeah, I think we could, maybe be interested in that. We might have to work through some urban versus rural issues. We might have to work through some privacy concerns, and that's probably a longer-term solution. Okay, so that's, that one's sort of there. Other folks have suggested, well, could you broaden the base of taxes that go into the highway trust fund? Are there other types of user fees, customs and border fees, that maybe could go into the trust fund and help shore it up? Yeah, we might be able to look at that, but we have such a significant shortfall for the trust fund, it's going to take a whole lot of more fees to go into that trust fund to make it whole again, never mind to significantly grow federal levels of investment in surface transportation. So Congress has decided, for any number of reasons, which we can get into or not get into, that since 2008, when the trust fund first hit a shortfall, that we will take money from the general fund of the U.S. Treasury and plug up the highway trust fund with that money. As Jeff said, and I've said, it's $140 billion, and Congress has been doing that for 12 years, on and off for 12 years. So I think, it'll be interesting to see what the committees will want to do in Congress and where the White House will end up being on this issue. Chairman Barrasso and Ranking Member Carper, they lead the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, which has jurisdiction over the Federal Aid Highway Program. They had a unanimous vote out of committee for their bill, $287 billion over 5 years. And the bill, unfortunately, has not progressed much further. Why? Because the Senate hasn't yet coalesced around how they want to fund that bill. How are they going to put the money that that bill needs into the Highway Trust Fund? They're working on it, but there's no solution yet. On the House side, with this framework that I mentioned earlier, there is still not a pay-for the whole $760 billion, nor just even a pay-for related to the money that we need for the Highway Trust Fund. There's signals that they want to work with the White House, so that's hopefully promising. But where there's a lot of recognition of the problem and not necessarily a whole lot of coalescing around an individual solution or solutions. So absent that, it's difficult for these bills to move forward, and we can end up in a situation where we have a series of extensions of current law.
Marc, I know that you've been working closely with Chairman Bugg to analyze the impact of the electrification of our system and fuel efficiency, and I'm curious if you would talk to us a little bit about that.
Thanks. We have a couple of slides here that I wanted to briefly step through, and Murphie commented on how the current draft bills that we have are talking a lot about green energy and lower carbon emitting initiatives and the impact of that. And we've talked a little bit about the impact of the shortfall in the revenue and trying to find new revenue. But as we talk about these issues and we talk about electrical vehicles, this first slide, if we can pull it up, is from J.P. Morgan. It's an estimate of the impact of electric and hybrid vehicles into our new vehicle mix. And those are the colored lines at the bottom, and you can continue to see the dramatic increase, the dramatic percentage of new vehicle sales that are represented by electric and hybrid vehicles. And this is an old slide. This is a slide that was developed earlier this year. If anybody has been paying attention to the stock market lately, there's been a significant run-up in the price of Tesla stock. So somebody's thinking that we're going to still sell a whole lot more Teslas coming up. And every time this slide is updated, you see more significant predictions about the impact of electric vehicles. Go to the next slide here. And this shows what the impact is going to be on our traditional transportation revenues, our motor fuel taxes, our motor fuel user fees. $23.7 billion in motor fuel taxes generated, dropping to $18 billion by 2040. And this doesn't even account for the impact of inflation. So we're seeing a dramatic and a significant decline in our motor fuel revenues. And then lastly, we've got to realize that those motor fuel revenues contribute in 2016 and 2017 to 65% of our highway trust fund revenue sources. Jeff talked about some of those other revenue sources that we use and plug the hole in, but 65% of our motor fuel, of our highway trust fund revenue is comprised of fuel sales coming from cars and trucks. And similarly, it's a sizable portion at the state level as well. And so the thing that we have to be aware of and we have to keep in mind is that the funding for all of these initiatives, these green energy initiatives, these alternative fuel initiatives, they come from the revenue, by and large, that we generate from our traditional motor fuels tax. And if we're not careful, if Congress isn't careful and doesn't address this, we're going to be literally sawing off the limb we're sitting on when it comes to financing our transportation system going forward. And so this is going to be an important issue for us to be aware of and to keep track going forward.
We have a question from the audience, and I want to shift and take that real quick. And the question is, should federal funding be tied to any type of performance metrics? MAP 21, of course, had performance metrics built into it, but it was not tied to any funding, and I'm curious if our panelists have an opinion on that. Concerns? Do you see potential benefits?
There's a little bit in the FAST Act that just started happening in the last couple of years. States that have their national highway system bridge conditions drop below a certain rate. Now, I believe 6 or 7 states collectively had to take $500 million of their general purpose apportionments and spend it just to improve NHS highway bridges. And this year, for the first time, Washington State plus Puerto Rico and DC saw their average interstate pavement condition drop below a certain performance measure, and they are having to dedicate larger shares of their flexible funding just to interstate maintenance. So it's there on the penalty side. It's difficult to figure out how far you can go on rewarding people with total dollars, because if you penalize people and take away their overall dollars for failing to meet targets, then you're taking away from the places with the greatest needs, and it's not need-based. And there's also a question of, are you rewarding, if you do incentivize it, are you rewarding people who are succeeding already when you could move money around elsewhere? But Murphie, you worked on the bill that started this.
I agree with what Jeff was saying. It's is it a carrot or a stick? Are you trying to give the states that have had reductions in fatalities and serious injuries on all their public roads more money? If I give those ones who are performing well more money, then do I have less money to give to the states that, for whatever reason, are having more safety challenges and similar issues with bridge and pavement? And it was something we struggled with. I think at a higher level, if you're just wanting to have a policy conversation, then it probably makes a lot of sense to shift more towards federal funding being tied to performance management, how states are setting their performance measures and targets. But again, without the funding needed to provide states with help from the federal level, you get into much more of a stick approach, which can cause some members some heartburn, and you very quickly get into the politics. And I think it creates dynamics among the states that maybe are not always helpful. And I think the question really comes back to something that I think Jeff raised early in his presentation, which is, what is the national vision? What is the federal role? We used to have a really good understanding of that. We were building the interstate system. Is that still what we need today, or is there a fundamental shift occurring for federal surface transportation policy and programs? And I don't think we have a good answer on that quite yet. I will just mention briefly, sort of, from my former boss's, Chairman Schuster's perspective, he really did feel very strongly in a federal role in surface transportation. One of the things that he put in the FAST Act was what I refer to as the Interstate 2.0 study. We asked the Transportation Research Board to go and look at what the future interstate system would look like. If we had a blank piece of paper right now and it wasn't, the 1940s and 50s, what would this system look like, and what would the federal role be in that system? And one of the reasons why he felt strongly about doing that is he had his committee staff and the Federal Highway Administration helped us run some numbers in terms of trying to figure out just how many congressional districts had a segment of the interstate system, 1 mile, in their district. And it turned out that based on how the districts were drawn at the time that we did this analysis, there was only one member of Congress that didn't have a single interstate system mile in their district. It's in Florida, actually, of all places, which is not where I would have guessed. But he wanted that information because I think he really felt strongly that it was time to come back to looking at the interstate system, looking at the future of transportation, and trying to provide a map for the future Congresses to consider when they were trying to figure out what that vision should be, what should those national goals be, what do we need to be doing at the federal level.
I want to go back to the timing, or to the authorization bill and timing. Obviously, it takes a lot of floor time to debate a surface transportation authorization bill. You have hearings, we're a couple months into this year. The impeachment process took a lot of time in the Senate, and so Jeff, I'm curious about your thoughts on what are your thoughts on if there's a prayer for an infrastructure bill this year?
History is not does not look kindly on this lately. The Senate keeps getting less and less done in election years in general, and the level of House versus Senate versus presidential cooperation on a lot of things is not particularly high right now. But the Senate is working towards at least getting its bills out of committee this year. The highway bills part is already out. The transit and safety part are being worked on. The House is about a couple of months, I think, away from trying to move bills through committee. And in 1 hour and 15 minutes, the president is going to release his plan as part of the fiscal 2021 budget, which is going to be an actual real $1 trillion of spending this time. It's going to be basically revolved around surface transportation as the core of a national infrastructure plan. 10-year reauthorization of highway trust fund programs at $755 billion. Another $55 billion in general fund authorizations for mass transit, Amtrak, and some railroad grants and odds and ends. That gets you to $810 billion, and then there's a separate $190 billion plug of FY21 money outside that for something or other, which may be projects of national significance or mega projects. We're going to wait until 11:30 and see those details. So the president is going to be out with the overall outline of his plan today. They're going to fill it out with a full-fledged bill within another 2 months, I think, once it gets done getting interagency review. And then we'll see if there's some kind of common ground they can find in an election year, because everyone likes infrastructure, but no one wants to find a couple $100 billion to pay for the extra spending. And I'm not sure that trying to find any kind of user tax increase in an election year is going to sell. But if they can steal $60 billion from the Federal Reserve once, they can find some other, magic ticket to offset another general fund transfer to the trust fund maybe this year.
I'm going to take a question from the audience. Should the federal government or state government focus on equity for alternatively fueled vehicles? Marc, you kind of touched on this with the impact of electrification to the Highway Trust Fund. Do you want to take a first stab at answering this?
It certainly is, this is a policy question, and being a government employee, I tend to stay away from the policy questions directly, but my point in showing those slides is it is a significant impact. And presently electric vehicles do not contribute in Texas to as users of our transportation system. And the longer we go without addressing that, two things are going to happen. The more significant an impact it's going to have on our transportation revenue that we rely upon for doing all sorts of investments, both on the transit side and the highway side and alternative transportation modes as well. But it's also going to become more difficult because there's going to be more and more of those people that have alternative fuel vehicles, and they will see that any type of measure that occurs that might require them to contribute more as users of the transportation system, they'll feel that as a tax on them, and so there'll be a challenge to address that revenue matter going forward if we continue to delay taking steps on that.
Yeah, I should also say I believe there's a behind-the-scenes understanding in the Senate. The chairman of the committee that wrote the highway part of the bill, Senator Barrasso, also has a bill to tax electric vehicles and put those taxes in the trust fund. And it's not that much money, but he also is including, for the first time, funding from the Highway Trust Fund on his spending side of the bill for EV charging infrastructure. And I believe there's a deal behind the scenes that they will have funding out of the trust fund for EV infrastructure in exchange for some kind of highway trust fund tax on EVs in this bill. If the tax committee doesn't tax EVs, the electric infrastructure funding is coming out of the bill. The revenues won't amount to a hill of beans in the next 5 years, but the idea is to get the principle locked in place that because EVs are used on highways, they should pay some kind of highway user taxes, and then 5 years from now, we'll have hopefully a good highway cost allocation study, and we can fairly allocate the costs of their use to those vehicles.
We have another audience question that kind of is along those same lines. Millennials and Generation Z are driving less and owning fewer autos. How will this generational gap impact future gas revenue?
Well, yes,
Yes.
It's going to impact it, and that's the central question: is how do we address those, the funding and the financing of those modes of transportation that many millennials and Gen Zers are looking to as their primary choice for traveling from point A to point B? It's an important question.
Gasoline tax revenues are already projected at the current rate. Each penny of gas tax is going to decrease. The amount of money it brings into your treasury, whether federal or state, is going to drop by about 1% a year, projected by the budget office, forever. It's a combination of cars becoming more fuel efficient because of the CAFE standards and the trend towards electric vehicles and hybrids, and possibly a bit of this. This hasn't been modeled yet, and a lot of times when millennials and Gen Zers get old enough to have kids and want to have a house with a yard, their driving patterns change drastically. So I would be hesitant about assuming that younger cohorts' driving patterns are going to hold up for their entire lives.
Murphie, I have a question about the administration's role in this process. And we kind of touched on it a little bit with the release of the budget coming later on today. But if an authorization bill passed tomorrow, how do you think this administration would leave their mark on it? What are their priorities?
Well, I think every administration that comes in, whether it's a Republican administration or a Democratic administration, they have policy priorities for transportation across the Department of Transportation. And this administration has early on, I think focused on leveraging levels of investment from state and local entities. I think that is still true. There was a pretty heavy emphasis on the role that the private sector could play in helping to rebuild the nation's infrastructure. They've placed a heavy emphasis on safety, which most administrations do, but it continues to be a big area of focus. Whether you're in the administration or on Capitol Hill, safety is one of the shared priorities. They have also focused a lot on rural states and rural communities across the country that they felt have not had enough of an emphasis or focus in prior years. So I think the biggest way that the administration will have an impact on the bill is putting forward some proposal with some level of detail about what they're looking for in a surface transportation reauthorization bill. That really can influence the process. Typically as a courtesy, the House would introduce an administration's bill just so that it can be out there and they can react to it, assuming that it is a real bill and comes in the form of legislative text and is not, sort of 10 or 15 principles about what they're looking to see. I think if they can do that and put that out, that'll be really helpful to the conversation. You sort of can kind of have those three legs of the stool come together. The administration has an opinion, the Senate has an opinion, and the House has an opinion. And somehow we have to find that compromise. We have to find that consensus. People are going to have a half a loaf sometimes on what they want, but that's the art of a negotiation. That's the art of the deal. Then going forward, hopefully, if that bill is enacted, the administration will have the enormous task of actually figuring out what Congress meant when they wrote those words on the page and then voted for it. There's usually opportunities for an administration to put their stamp on certain things. Like if you look at some of the competitive grant programs over the years in recent bills, the The FAST Act called it the Nationally Significant Freight and Highway Projects Program. It was meant to fund nationally and regionally significant freight and highway projects that states had a difficult time funding with their annual formula dollars. The Obama administration had their first opportunity with that program to dole out some grants, and they called it the Fast Lane program, and they chose to focus on things that were in keeping with the law, but there was also some ability for them to kind of layer in some of their administrative priorities. You know, this administration, the Trump administration, came in. They now call it the Infra Grant Program. And they have focused on sort of, again, leveraging how much state and local money is being put forward in an application for a grant under this program. What federal amount is being asked for? Is there a rural component to the project? Is there a safety component? Are they using an innovative project delivery method? Are they doing something to deal with environmental streamlining barriers to getting these projects out the door? So you'll see that throughout a bill. Once it becomes law, there are those opportunities for the administration to put their stamp on it. And then there are other programs and policies where there really is no ambiguity and they have to kind of follow what Congress put in place.
Previously, the administration has focused on leverage of private dollars, of state dollars, local dollars, non-federal dollars. There was also a lot of discussion about the concept of asset recycling, and I'm curious if the panel thinks that we're going to continue to see those as an issue moving forward.
Sure. I mean, from the administration point of view, what's not to like? Finding ways for somebody else who is not the United States Treasury to pay for infrastructure that the federal government gets credit for. It's a no-brainer. But the opportunities for those things are fairly limited and generally tend to be in areas that have enough throughput to have some kind of dedicated revenue stream, where it's tolling or what have you. Without a dedicated revenue stream, a lot of those, few of those leveraging plans will work. I remember at the last of the big blue ribbon panels for surface transportation reform was given its report in February 2009, and Steve Heminger said, find me the Wall Street investment bank that's willing to go into a partnership to pave potholes in Montana, and then I will tell you have found the great solution. Until you find that, these leveraging opportunities can be useful where there's a dedicated revenue stream to pay them back. Beyond that, it's a bit iffier.
I think by and large, if you hear much talk about federal infrastructure banks and TIFIA and trying to address these issues in that manner, it's unfortunate because we're ducking the core issue, and that's the lack of the revenue needed to effectively improve not only our federal rate of return, but set us on a course of being sustainable for the future.
On that note, I want to talk about Governor Abbott's recent comments. He made news a couple weeks ago with his comments about the changing transportation landscape, and he cited ride-hailing platforms, increased walking, and migration toward high-density communities. And that seems to be something that's occurring nationwide. I think nationwide we're anticipating that. But Marc, I wanted to ask you, how is Txdot preparing for this evolution?
Well, it's an exciting time to be in transportation right now. And the technological changes that are occurring are unlike any that I've seen in my career. The rate of change in how people move and travel is just rapidly evolving. And one of the areas that we've been involved in, and I think tomorrow you'll hear a panel with Darren Anderson on it, has been in engaging the companies, the stakeholders that are part of those initiatives to understand what we can be doing and providing as a state. And fortunately, Texas has some inherent advantages. We've got a lot of people and a lot of stuff to move around. And that's why we as a state are frequently looked to as test beds for piloting new vehicle technologies. We're also a low regulation state, low regulatory state, and that too is attractive. So I think you're going to continue to see more of those companies coming to Texas to start or to test their programs, but there's still a lot to flesh out. Understanding what the future role of federal, state, county, and local governments in coordinating and managing these new technologies is still a topic that has got to play out over the coming years, because it's happening quickly, and we're going to have to work collectively in partnership to really understand how we manage that effectively going forward.
We're going into our last couple minutes of the panel, so I want to end on an audience question. We have a question which is, what can we as transportation stakeholders do to affect change when it comes to Texas receiving its fair share of federal funding? And I want to expand on that a little bit, because I feel like we've really covered the topic of Texas receiving its fair share of federal funding. So I want to expand on that too. What can stakeholders do to engage in the process of ensuring good government and fair government? And I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts on that.
I will say, from my time on the Hill, Texas, whether you were with Texas Department of Transportation or you were with one of the companies that operate in the state or you were a local government entity, you all really do lead the way in terms of engaging with your congressional delegation. And I would applaud you for that, and I urge you all to continue to kind of do that engagement and building those relationships with your members of Congress, with the committee staff that really want to understand how these issues in Washington, when we're inside the Beltway and I'm in my DC bubble and not out here with you all, what those really mean, and those real life stories and those anecdotes are supremely important. And I think we're seeing a lot more activism across the states on these issues, and they're really engaging at the federal level. Not only with Congress, but we're seeing a lot more engagement, I think, with the federal agencies that have the opportunities to provide grants or are really sort of tasked with implementing these policies. So I would just encourage you all to keep doing that, keep building those relationships, keep that information sharing going. And I think that will really have a positive influence on federal policy and how the folks up in DC kind of think about these issues.
Yes, just quickly engaging, as Murphy mentioned. If you all, there's 1,000 people in the room here, there's 1,000 different opinions on things that we've talked about today. It's important for you all to express those opinions to those who represent you in Washington, D.C., your members of Congress and our two senators. They need to hear from you. If you've written them a letter, send them an email, contact them, tag them on social media with comments and thoughts that you have, because it's important that you communicate how, the need to address things like rate of return are, and to be informed and aware of how these discussions are going with respect to federal reauthorization. I will say that just getting a new reauthorization is not necessarily a good thing if we are not getting a good bill going forward. And I would say that while there are some positive aspects on both the Senate and the House side, there's some very, very troubling elements that are in both of those infrastructure bill proposals. Namely, one of the things that has been talked about or appears to be components of both sides might be a reduction in the overall percentage of our core formulas, our core programs. Right now, 92% of the money comes through our core programs that get distributed out to Txdot and our MPOs. That might drop to 90%. And so if we look at increasing our rate of return on our core program, but the overall core program has shrunk, we haven't gained any ground. And so there's a lot of issues at play that we've got to be aware of, and maintaining awareness and information on those is important for all of us.
Fair share is somewhat eye of the beholder, but I would say pick your fights well. Again, Texas pays 10% of the gas tax, which is shrinking forever, but you pay 13% of the diesel and trucking taxes, which are actually projected to grow each year. Diesel is going to stay about constant. Those trucking taxes are going to grow 2 or 3% a year. So I would say that from a federal perspective, an encouragement to focus the federal program more on the core national highway system, which where almost all the highway freight goes, with your greater percentage of payment into that is probably a better approach, and then let the stuff with less of a core federal interest that comes out of the gasoline tax that you pay, a lesser share of, be focused on that.
We're out of time. I want to thank everyone for attending this panel, and on behalf of the panel, we'd like to thank everyone who participated via Facebook. Thank you, and we'll see you soon for our next panel. Thank you.